Hey guys! Tonight we begin with an animal that has quietly ruled humanity through charm, judgment, and a total lack of obedience, the cat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all started with humanity's favorite bad habit, optimism. Around 10,000 years ago, someone in the Fertile Crescent looked at a handful of seeds and said, "What if I just planted these and stayed here forever?" And just like that, agriculture was born along with taxes, property disputes, and the first HOA complaints. Farming brought food security, which was great, and rats, which were not. Grain stores became tiny rodent resorts. All-you-can-eat buffets with unlimited reproduction. At night, the sound of tiny chewing filled the air, a lullaby of regret for choosing civilization. Then came the African wild cat, Felis sylvestris liba, the desert's answer to pest control. Sleek, silent, and fundamentally unimpressed, it strolled into human camps like it owned the lease. It didn't come to help, it came to hunt, but the result was the same. Fewer rats, fewer diseases, and one very confused species of early farmer wondering why this furry little sociopath kept hanging around. No one tamed the first cats. There was no domestication event. It was more like an extended hostage negotiation. The cats stayed because the food was easy, and the humans tolerated them because the rats weren't. It was the world's first symbiotic relationship built entirely on mutual indifference. Every now and then, a particularly brave farmer tried to pet one and learned a valuable lesson about boundaries. The cats didn't purr, they hissed, bit, and went right back to work. And yet, over generations, something strange happened. The least violent cats lived longer around humans, and the humans, against all logic, started liking them. Stockholm Syndrome, but with whiskers. Eventually, cats realized that glaring silently while providing minimum effort guaranteed free food, a lesson that still forms the backbone of every modern feline-human relationship. The rats kept coming, the cats kept killing, and humanity, for the first time in its history, entered into a stable, long-term partnership that didn't immediately end in fire. No contracts, no loyalty, just a quiet understanding. You handle the vermin and we'll pretend you're cute. And for 10,000 years, that deal has held, proving once again that evolution's favorite joke is letting humans think they're in charge. No one remembers the exact moment humans and cats made a deal, mostly because neither side acknowledged it. It wasn't a handshake, it wasn't a ceremony, and it definitely wasn't mutual respect. It was more of a silent understanding that went something like, "You keep the rats out of the grain, and we'll try not to throw shoes at you." This was the world's first non-verbal labor contract, and it's still legally binding in every household today. The cats didn't move in with humans. They allowed themselves to live nearby. They'd lurk around granaries, pick off a few mice, then stare directly into the souls of farmers as if to say, "You're welcome." And the farmers, bless their desperate hearts, mistook that cold indifference for cooperation. Unlike dogs who begged, fetched, and built entire religions around human approval, cats treated the partnership like an unpaid internship. They disappear for days, return with half a rat, and act like they just negotiated world peace. Humans, ever the sentimental idiots, began leaving scraps out for them, convinced they'd earned the animal's affection. It wasn't affection, it was rent. Over generations, the same quiet pattern repeated. The friendliest wild cats, meaning the ones who didn't immediately remove chunks of your forearm, lingered closer to human settlements. They tolerated being around people, occasionally let someone pet them, and managed to look deeply disappointed the entire time. Humans, meanwhile, interpreted every flick of the tail as love. They started painting cats on pottery, carving them into charms, even calling them companions. It was history's first case of mass emotional projection. But make no mistake, cats were still fully wild. They hunted alone, mated loudly, and refused to listen to anyone. And yet they stayed because humans were sloppy. Rats were plentiful, and the arrangement worked. So, while the rest of the animal kingdom evolved through survival or cooperation, cats evolved through sheer vibe management. They gave nothing, demanded everything, and got it anyway. Thus, the silent contract was born, a 10-0, 0-0 year agreement between two species who would never fully trust each other, but also couldn't stand being apart. The humans thought they had tamed nature. The cats thought they had found indoor plumbing. Technically, both were right. Domestication, as it turns out, wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a slow, awkward process that probably started with a hungry cat and an overly optimistic farmer. Nobody tamed anything. They just tolerated each other until evolution got bored and made it official. Over time, something strange began to happen. Among all those wild cats prowling the edges of human villages, some were a little less stabby. A few didn't bolt at the first sight of humans, and one or two even allowed themselves to be petted without summoning demons. Those were the ones that survived, because being slightly friendlier meant access to food, warmth, and the occasional idiot willing to share their leftovers. The cats didn't evolve because humans trained them. They evolved because they figured us out. They noticed that if you make big eyes, tilt your head, and pretend to care, humans will feed you. It's the same strategy influencers use today. This wasn't domestication. It was psychological warfare, fought quietly over generations with purring as the main weapon. Humans, of course, thought they were in control. They started referring to the animals as our cats, as though ownership could be declared over a creature that routinely ignored commands, personal space, and property rights. Archaeologists have found ancient pottery showing humans cuddling cats, and you can almost see the confusion on both faces. To the humans, it was love. To the cat, it was a brief hostage situation with snacks. Natural selection favored the cats that could fake affection. The hissers, the biters, and the emotionally unavailable wanderers. So 95% of them slowly became outnumbered by their slightly more patient cousins. And from that tiny genetic shift, Felis catus was born. The domesticated cat, of course. Domesticated is a generous term. The modern house cat still retains 95% of its wild genome, which is science's polite way of saying it's just pretending. They don't hunt because they have to. They hunt because they're bored. They don't cuddle for warmth. They cuddle because it makes you drop your guard. So no, cats didn't change to fit human society. Humanity just adapted to living with a beautiful little sociopath that purr while plotting your downfall. Evolution calls it symbiosis. We call it cute. By around 2000 B.C., humanity had fully fallen for the scam. What started as a practical pest control agreement had evolved into mass emotional dependence. The Egyptians, brilliant architects, mathematicians, and chronic overachievers, looked at cats and decided, yes, this tiny apex predator is clearly divine. Egypt was the world's first cat cult, and it was magnificent. The African wildcat, once a scrappy rodent assassin, was now lounging in palaces wearing gold jewelry. People worshipped them, painted them, and in some cases fed them better than their servants. Killing one, even by accident, was punishable by death. Imagine explaining to your family that Uncle Horm got executed because he stepped on Bastet's favorite furball. At the center of this feline fanaticism was Bastet, the headed goddess of the home, fertility, and music. Basically, the ancient world's version of a Pinterest mom. Her temples were filled with cats that priests fed, groomed, and probably apologized to regularly. Egyptian art is full of them, sleek, graceful cats sitting under chairs, playing with fish, or judging humans in hieroglyphic silence. They were depicted as protectors of families and destroyers of serpents. Though, to be fair, most of their actual destroying was probably limited to knocking over things that were expensive. Archaeologists have even uncovered entire cat cemeteries, filled with mummified felines wrapped in linen and tucked away with offerings. One site alone contained over 300 cat mummies. That's not religion, that's a national obsession. And the best part, the cats didn't have to do anything to earn it. They just stared into the sun and occasionally pretended to listen. For the Egyptians, the cat embodied something no other animal could: independence. Dogs were loyal. Cows were useful. But cats did whatever they wanted and still got warped. It was the ultimate power move. And humans for once respected that. So by the time the pyramids were standing and the pharaohs were mummifying their pets, one thing was certain: cats had already won. They went from rodent hunters to living gods in just a few thousand years. And they've been coasting off that reputation ever since. If you wanted proof that ancient Egypt had gone completely cat-brained, you didn't have to look far. You just had to look up. Everywhere you went, there she was. Bastet, the lioness-turned-house cat goddess, smiling serenely from temples, jewelry, and the occasional household altar. She wasn't just warped, she was adored. Originally, Bastet was a fierce lion-headed war deity, the kind who'd maul your enemies and look good doing it. But over the centuries, she mellowed. People started depicting her as a domestic cat, gentle and protective. In other words, the gods had done what every cat owner eventually does. They went soft. Her cult exploded across Egypt. Bastet became the patron of music, fertility, motherhood, and most importantly, good vibes. Her temples in Bubastis were legendary, filled with cats lounging on sunlit altars, purring like tiny engines of holiness. Pilgrims traveled for days to leave offerings, gold trinkets, baskets of fish, and occasionally entire mummified cats, because apparently nothing says devotion like gift, wrapping your pet. Eternity, killing a cat, even by accident, was a death sentence. There's an account of a Roman soldier who killed a cat in Alexandria and was torn apart by an angry mob before the pharaoh could intervene. That's right. The empire that conquered the world couldn't survive a domestic feline incident. To the Egyptians, cats weren't pets. They were protectors. They guarded the home from snakes, rodents, and evil spirits, which statistically speaking made them more effective than most priests. Families kept them near cradles to watch over infants. Some even believed a cat's purr could heal. The theory modern science still hasn't entirely disproved, though mostly because no one's willing to argue with a cat. Bastet's popularity turned Egypt into the first recorded cat utopia. Temples became sanctuaries where cats could eat, sleep, and ignore worshippers in peace, which honestly still sounds like paradise. Through Bastet, cats ascended from helpful pest killers to divine intermediaries, living proof that the quickest way to immortality is to convince humanity you're slightly mystical and extremely photogenic. It was the perfect arrangement. Egypt gave them temples, the cats gave them indifference, and somehow both sides thought they were the blessed ones. If you thought cats being worshipped was the peak of Egyptian devotion, think again. The ancient Egyptians didn't just love their cats. They wanted them to outlive them, which, let's be honest, was already happening naturally. Welcome to the era of cat mummification, a booming industry of spiritual embalming, linen wrapping, and mass feline flattery. Archaeologists have uncovered cat necropolises, literal cities of the dead, filled with millions of tiny mummies, each one neatly wrapped, labeled, and buried with the kind of ceremony most humans could only dream of. The idea was simple. Cats were sacred to Bastet, so giving one a proper burial brought good fortune in the afterlife. It's the same logic people use today when lighting a candle for their Wi-Fi router. Egyptians believed that by offering cats to the goddess, they were ensuring protection, fertility, and happiness, which is impressive considering cats don't protect, reproduce on command, or make anyone happy for longer than 5 minutes. But the system got commercial. Demand for mummified cats skyrocketed, and temple priests saw a business opportunity. Entire breeding operations emerged, raising kittens purely for ritual sacrifice. It's dark, yes, but also the earliest example of a full-scale pet economy. Bastet's temple was basically Amazon Prime for divine offerings. Order one cat mummy, receive spiritual blessings in 2 to 3 business days. Some cat mummies were genuine. Others were cheap knockoffs stuffed with straw, feathers, or in one case an eel. That means ancient Egypt had fake cat scams, proving once again that capitalism is eternal. Imagine being a devout pilgrim, paying for divine favor, and unwrapping your holy relic only to find something that smells like low tide. Despite the moral and electory chaos, the devotion was real. Cats remained untouchable, revered, and hilariously in control. They'd strut through temples, eat sacred offerings, and occasionally swipe jewelry off altars, living gods with zero self-awareness. So yes, in the land of pharaohs and pyramids, entire generations spent their lives embalming animals that couldn't care less. It wasn't just faith. It was mass delusion with good lighting, and through it all, the cats simply blinked slowly. Because for them, immortality had already been achieved. By now, cats weren't just animals. They were influencers with divine endorsement deals. Egypt had effectively turned an apex predator into a luxury brand, and business was booming. Bastet was trending. Cat temples had 5-star ratings, and being seen with one of these furry deities said, "I'm spiritually enlightened, but also fashionable." The pharaohs leaned hard into it. Cats appeared on jewelry, pottery, and tomb walls. The message was clear. If you wanted eternal life, it helped to have a cat staring disinterestedly at you while you died. Priests called them symbols of purity. Artists called them muses. Realists called them what they were, tiny narcissists with murder mittens. And they had marketing. The Egyptian artisans who depicted cats knew their audience. Cats were drawn lounging, sleek and perfect, sometimes even wearing gold earrings. No one painted the version that yowled at 3:00 a.m. or brought half-dead at lizards to your doorstep. The myth was carefully curated. The first ever feline PR campaign. Cats became shorthand for divine poise, the living manifestation of balance between chaos and grace, which is ironic considering their actual behavior consisted mostly of knocking fragile things off tables and staring blankly at walls. But the Egyptians were committed. They saw that contradiction and called it mystery. Every noble household had cats, not for pest control anymore, but for prestige. A cat walking into a banquet was like a celebrity cameo. Guests would bow, servants would offer milk, and the cat would ignore everyone because it had more important existential things to do, like staring at the ceiling. The higher classes even began breeding cats selectively, not for friendliness, but for aesthetics. Sleeker coats, darker stripes, more regal stares. Egypt didn't just invent the concept of royalty. It invented the concept of looking royal while doing nothing. In short, cats had gone full divine influencer. They didn't have to perform, contribute, or even care. Their beauty was their power. The more detached they seemed, the more humans adored them, proving that ancient Egypt didn't just worship cats. It invented the modern celebrity. And while humans built statues and shrines in their honor, the cats simply blinked once slowly. Egypt's greatest civilization reduced to their marketing department. As Egypt basked in its golden age of cat worship, another quieter revolution was happening. Cats were going global. They didn't plan it, of course. Cats don't plan anything beyond nap here and kill that. But thanks to human trade routes, they began their great accidental migration. The cat diaspora. You see, ships in the ancient world were floating buffets for rodents, grain, food stores, and ropes. All prime real estate for vermin, and sailors, desperate to not have their bread eaten or their toes nibbled, started bringing cats aboard. Not because they loved them, but because they worked sort of. The cats did what they always do. They showed up, killed a few mice, napped in the sun, and occasionally knocked something valuable into the sea. Sailors didn't mind. A cat on a ship was good luck, unless, of course, it stared into the dark corner of the hull for too long, in which case the crew assumed it had seen a ghost and everyone panicked. From the Nile to the Aegean, cats spread through trade like furry little diplomats of chaos. Egyptian merchants brought them to Greece, Phoenicia, and eventually Rome, where they were welcomed as both pest control and conversation pieces. It was the Bronze Age's version of a viral trend. Every port wanted a cat because Egypt had cats and Egypt was cool. Unlike most animals, cats didn't need to be domesticated in each new place. They just stepped off the boat, saw the local rats, and started working freelance. The species didn't spread because humans wanted companionship. It spread because humanity had crumbs. As centuries passed, the cat became the unsung backbone of maritime history. They guarded granaries, accompanied armies, and slept through most of it. They crossed deserts, oceans, and borders, leaving paw prints in temples and tombs from Persia to Pompeii. And wherever they went, they left the same impression, efficient, mysterious, and ever so slightly condescending. Civilizations rose and fell, empires burned, philosophers debated the nature of the soul. The cats just kept traveling, surviving, and quietly judging every human innovation along the way. So, while humans conquered the world for glory, cats did it by accident and with much better posture. When cats finally padded their way into ancient Greece, they entered a civilization obsessed with beauty, order, and geometry. Three things cats respect in theory, but destroy in practice. Before the feline invasion, Greeks relied on weasels for pest control. Yes, actual weasels, shrieking, feral little chaos gremlins who lived in people's homes and occasionally bit them. So when sailors brought over sleek Egyptian cats that didn't smell like death or steal your sandals, it was love at first, nonchalant glance. Cats fit perfectly into the Greek aesthetic. They were elegant, self-contained, and completely indifferent, which coincidentally is how most philosophers described the gods. The Greeks admired restraint and composure, and the cat was basically the embodiment of both. Even Aristotle would have respected an animal that could ignore you so efficiently. Soon cats became the new pets of the upper class, not the working kind of pets like dogs, but the ornamental kind, like furniture that occasionally blinked. In Athens, they lounged in courtyards, basking in sunlight and existential superiority. Poets wrote about them. Artists painted them. Women adored them, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in a creature that was graceful, mysterious, and always slightly unimpressed. Meanwhile, the cats didn't care. They were still doing their job, hunting mice, lounging by oil lamps, and occasionally climbing onto important scrolls at exactly the wrong time. Every civilization that hosted them learned the same lesson. A cat will solve your rat problem, but it will replace it with an ego problem. The weasels, of course, were furious. They lost their jobs overnight. You can almost imagine them holding tiny picket signs outside granaries reading, "Egyptian imports are ruining local business." But nobody listened. Cats had better PR and much better fur. By the time of the Hellenistic period, cats had secured their place as both pest control and status symbol, the animal version of a philosopher's toga. They didn't obey commands, but they didn't need to. Simply existing gracefully was enough to make Greeks worship them. It was the perfect cultural fit. One society obsessed with reason and one animal that operated entirely without it. The Greeks tried to understand cats. The cats understood everything and just pretended not to. When the Romans adopted cats, they didn't just get pets. They got furry anarchists that ignored every social structure Rome ever invented. For an empire obsessed with law, order, and Latin grammar, cats were a walking contradiction. They did nothing, followed no rules, and somehow everyone still fed them. At first, Romans only wanted them for practical reasons. Grain was life, rats were death, and cats were the fluffy middlemen of survival. Roman warehouses, ships, and villas all kept a few, usually referred to as mures bellator, mouse warriors. It sounds noble, but it mostly involved napping until something squeaked. Before cats, Romans used weasels and ferrets, which were efficient, but let's face it, not exactly photogenic. Cats, on the other hand, looked elegant even while committing murder. Soon they were appearing in mosaics, fresco, and household shrines. Archaeologists have found Roman cat skeletons buried with care, proof that even the world's toughest soldiers went soft for a purr. But cats didn't care about Roman authority. They ignored legions, emperors, and even the occasional gladiator trying to impress them. Imagine Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, trying to call a cat and being met with slow blinking. That's power. They fit perfectly into Roman society precisely because they didn't fit at all. Romans admired independence, dignity, and controlled arrogance. All traits the cat embodied naturally. A senator could lecture about discipline all morning, then go home to a creature that refused to acknowledge his existence. Philosophically, it was humbling. Spiritually, it was infuriating. In time, cats spread to every corner of the empire. From Britain's rainy outposts to Egypt's sunlit ports, they patrolled Roman streets, taverns, and temples. Sailors kept them on ships, farmers in barns, and noble women on silk cushions. They were the equal opportunity companions of Rome, adored by patricians and peasants alike, though equally indifferent to both. By the empire's peak, cats were a quiet constant, small, silent, and smug, as civilization collapsed around them. When Rome eventually fell, they didn't mourn it. They simply walked over the ruins, found the next grain store, and got back to work. The Romans built aqueducts and empires. The cats built legacies, one paw print at a time. While the cats of Egypt and Rome were busy reclining on cushions and perfecting the art of being warped, something entirely different was happening thousands of miles east. In ancient China and Southeast Asia, a new species of cat-human cooperation was forming, not out of religion or romance, but out of sheer agricultural desperation. Here, farmers had a different kind of problem. Rice paddies, silk stores, and more rodents than anyone had time for. Enter the Asian leopard cat, Preonurus bengalensis, smaller, wilder, and slightly more psychotic than its African cousin. It was a sleek, spotted hunter that didn't meow so much as it judged you in high definition. Unlike Egypt's pampered tabbies, these cats weren't divinely adored. They were tolerated like eccentric tenants who refused to leave. Farmers noticed that when these cats showed up, the mice disappeared. So they did the logical thing. They put out food and hoped for the best. The cats predictably took the food, murdered a few rodents, and never said thank you. This wasn't domestication. It was parallel evolution with a side of emotional distance. 2 continents, 2 human populations, and 2 completely separate species of wild cat, both coming to the same conclusion: these hairless apes might be worth freeloading off over generations. Some leopard cats became calmer, or at least stopped trying to claw their landlords. Farmers even started breeding them, which historians agree must have been an ambitious and deeply regretful decision. But these Asian domesticated cats never quite lost their wild streak. They were more decorative than affectionate, and while they excelled at pest control, they still regarded humans as suspicious roommates. In essence, they were the prototype for every modern cat that lets you pet it once, then disappears for 2 days. This second domestication event didn't last forever. Eventually, trade brought African cats eastward, sleeker, more adaptable, and slightly less murdery. The local cats were politely phased out, like an outdated software update that still occasionally crashes. Still, for a time, 2 distinct feline civilizations thrived, one basking in Egyptian gold, the other prowling Asian rice fields. 2 evolutionary branches, one shared personality, beautiful, mysterious, and absolutely uncooperative. It wasn't love. It was global conquest achieved through silence, cuteness, and total disregard for instructions. For a brief, glorious moment in history, the world was divided, not by empire or ideology, but by cats. On one side, the African wild cat, sleek and self-assured, lounging in Mediterranean villas like a furry aristocrat. On the other, the Asian leopard cat, smaller, moodier, and living out in the rice fields like an underpaid assassin. These weren't just different breeds. They were different worldviews. The African cats were refined opportunists. You feed me, I'll let you think you own me. The Asian ones were pure freelancers. You exist, and that's fine. Don't make it weird. For a few thousand years, both civilizations coexisted without knowing the other existed. 2 parallel feline societies, separated by geography and the mutual belief that humans were kind of idiots. And then, inevitably, global trade ruined everything. As sailors and merchants began hopping between continents, the African cat went full colonizer. Adaptable, sociable by cat standards, and slightly less homicidal, it spread eastward to India, to China, even to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The local leopard cats didn't stand a chance. Within centuries, their bloodlines faded, absorbed by their cooler, calmer cousins. Geneticists call this introgression. Historians might call it the feline version of cultural assimilation. But to the cats, it was probably just Tuesday. The Asian leopard cats didn't vanish entirely. They just got out-evolved by a species that had perfected the art of pretending to care. By the Iron Age, the descendants of both were meeting for the first time, probably under a wagon, deciding who got to eat the rat first. From there, they interbred, merged, and gave rise to the modern domestic cat, a creature whose DNA still carries the memory of both ancestors. The African hunter's confidence and the Asian loner's distrust. Scientists today can literally see this double heritage in a cat's genes and, frankly, in its personality. One moment it's affectionate, the next it's plotting your demise. It's not moody, it's bicultural. So yes, humanity domesticated cats twice, and the cats in return agreed to tolerate us once. They merged not for love nor loyalty, but simply because it was convenient. And if that isn't the purest expression of evolution, nothing is. By the time cats reached medieval Europe, they'd spent thousands of years perfecting their strategy. Stay quiet, look adorable, and let humans do the heavy lifting. It was working brilliantly until Europe, in its infinite wisdom, decided that anything independent, quiet, and nocturnal must be working for the devil. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when logic was burned at the stake. Cats, especially black ones, suddenly went from holy protectors of the harvest to alleged servants of Satan. Why? Because they stared too long. They moved too gracefully, and they didn't bark on command. In other words, they were guilty of being cats. The church led the charge, accusing cats of witchcraft, heresy, and general suspicious vibes. Monks preached that their glowing eyes were portals to hell. Priests warned that witches could turn into cats at night. And the peasants, who already feared thunder, mirrors, and literacy, panicked. The result, a continent-wide cat purge. Thousands were killed, burned, or thrown from towers in the name of spiritual hygiene. It was a rough time to have whiskers. Even just feeding a stray could get you accused of consorting with the occult. Humanity, in one of its proudest moments, declared war on its own pest control system. The cats naturally withdrew. They went feral, vanished into barns and forests, and probably muttered something equivalent to, "Good luck, idiots." Without cats, rats flourished. Grain stores filled with droppings, towns swarmed with vermin, and fleas multiplied unchecked. Europe was becoming one giant biological warning label. The irony was almost cosmic. The very animal accused of summoning evil had been keeping real evil in the form of plagiaridon rodents at bay. This was the great medieval mistake. A case study in superstition triumphing over survival instinct. Humanity had managed to turn its best ally into an enemy, and nature took notes. The cats, of course, didn't care. They'd been worshipped by gods and murdered by fools. Both experiences probably felt about the same. And while preachers droned about demons, the rats threw a party. A very large, very infectious party that would soon wipe out half of Europe. The moral: never fire your best employee during a crisis. After centuries of treating cats like demonic freeloaders, Europe finally got what it deserved, a biology lesson written in corpses. It began quietly in the mid-4th century. A few rats on a few ships carrying fleas full of Yinia pestes, a bacterium with no sense of humor and an excellent work ethic. Within months, the Black Death was on tour. People blamed everything except the obvious. Some blamed the stars. Others blamed foreigners. Many blamed God, who by that point was probably muttering, "I gave you cats for a reason." Towns emptied, crops rotted, and priests gave last rites faster than anyone could invent hand sanitizer. Meanwhile, the rats had a golden age. With cats nearly extinct from superstition and paranoia, the rodent population exploded. Fleas jumped, diseases spread, and human civilization turned into a cautionary tale. The cats, watching from the outskirts, probably took notes on how quickly humans could destroy themselves without assistance. By 1350, entire cities were ghost towns. 1/3 of Europe was gone. If there had been a medieval Yelp, the continent would have received 0 stars and a would not recommend. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The church had condemned cats as evil, and now evil had shown up. Microscopic, contagious, and delivered by the rats the cats used to eat. Eventually, people started to notice the pattern. Villages that still had a few cats seemed less dead. Maybe, just maybe, the furry little devil's helpers weren't so demonic after all. Slowly, cautiously, cats crept back into towns like divine retribution wrapped in fur. They hunted the rats, reduced the fleas, and restored a semblance of balance. Of course, humanity didn't apologize. It never does. Instead, they just acted like the whole thing had been part of the plan. The church quietly stopped mentioning cats in sermons. Peasants began feeding strays again, and the plague, insulted by the sudden competence, moved on to Asia. By the 15th century, the cat had reclaimed its throne, not through worship or politics, but through sheer unbothered survival. While Europe buried its dead, the cats just yawned, stretched, and went back to work, the only creatures in history to win a holy war by doing absolutely nothing. When the smoke of the Middle Ages finally cleared and half of Europe had either died, prayed itself hoarse, or invented new diseases, the cats returned. Not marching triumphantly, of course. That would have required enthusiasm. They just appeared one morning, stretching on rooftops, blinking at the sunlight, and pretending they'd been here the whole time. Europe didn't so much welcome them back as quietly pretend the whole demonic servant of Satan thing, had been a misunderstanding. Towns that once hunted cats were now begging for them. Farmers built little shelters. Nobles adopted them as house mascots, and monasteries kept them in libraries to guard against mice. A kind of reluctant holy reinstatement. The cats naturally accepted this redemption arc with total emotional neutrality. They didn't forgive, they didn't forget. They just resumed pest control and passive-aggressively shed on church manuscripts. To them, the plague had merely proven a point. Never underestimate the consequences of firing your best employee. By the Renaissance, cats had evolved from cursed creatures to cultural icons again. Painters included them in family portraits. Scholars kept them in studies. Queens paraded them as living jewelry. Leonardo da Vinci even sketched them mid-pounce, clearly impressed by something that could defy physics and etiquette at once. But even in their comeback, cats never gave too much. They refused obedience, ignored training, and offered affection only when it suited them. Humans called this mystery. Biologists call it behavioral dominance. From Egyptian temples to European castles, the pattern had come full circle. The cat's position in society rose, fell, and rose again, untouched by reason, religion, or rat. Every era thought it was using the cat. Every era was wrong. By the dawn of modernity, the cat had survived wars, plagues, and persecution, all without forming a single organized movement. Its strategy was simple. Stay beautiful, stay silent, and let humanity collapse under its own enthusiasm. So ends the preordained chapter of our uneasy alliance. The cat began as a wild hunter, became a god, then a witch, then a roommate. It has outlived pharaohs, popes, and empires, and it still won't come when called. Because in the end, humans never truly domesticated cats. Cats just domesticated civilization. The Mongol horse was more than an animal. It was a heartbeat that pulsed through the veins of the steppe. Without it, the Mongol Empire would have been impossible. Every conquest, every migration, every battle depended on these short, muscular creatures with eyes that mirrored the horizon. They weren't bred for beauty, but for survival. They didn't prance. They endured on the frozen plains where lesser beasts would perish. Mongol horses grazed through snow, scraping the icy crust with their hooves to reach the brittle grass below. To a Mongol, a horse wasn't property, it was kin. Herds roamed freely across the endless landscape, marked only by subtle brands and the memories of their masters. A Mongol could recognize his own horse's neigh amid 1,000 others. He could tell by the rhythm of its steps in the dark which one carried him home. There was no need for fences or barns. The land itself was their stable, and the sky their roof. From childhood, boys and girls alike were tossed onto the backs of colts before they could properly walk. Riding wasn't a skill, it was a birthright. Children learned balance on the moving back of life itself. Clutching manes, not saddles. A Mongol child might fall, bleed, and rise again, but he would never fear the horse. Fear was for those who didn't belong to the wind. The horses themselves were unlike any in the world. Sturdy, broad-headed, with manes that tangled in the storms. They carried warriors from sunrise to moonlight without complaint. They needed no shelter, no grain, no comfort. Their strength came from the same hunger and cold that forged their riders. A good horse could sense a coming snowstorm before the clouds gathered. Another could find its way home through the pitch-dark steppe, guided only by memory and magnetism. In Mongol belief, the horse's spirit was sacred. Songs were sung to them, not about them. Warriors whispered to their mounts before battle, as if speaking to a trusted comrade. To strike a horse unjustly was a sin. To lose one in cowardice was shame. The Mongols lived because their horses lived, and through them they conquered the world. For the Mongols, breeding horses was never a matter of design. It was a pact with nature. No royal stables, no gilded reins. no meticulous breeding ledgers guided their choices. The only law was survival. A horse that faltered in winter, stumbled in mud, or tired after a long ride simply didn't pass its strength to the next generation. The steppe called the weak better than any human ever could. The result was a breed forged by frost, famine, and distance. A perfect balance of endurance, instinct, and stubborn will. Herds were vast, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Each family maintained its own group, allowing them to roam across open pastures without fences or guards. Stallions battled fiercely for dominance, and only the strongest earned the right to mate. Mares that couldn't produce hardy foss were quietly released to the wild. No sentiment, no favoritism, only the quiet logic of the land. The Mongols believed that to interfere too much in breeding would insult the wisdom of the steppe. In spring, foss were born under the open sky. There were no barns, only the earth's warmth and the mother's breath. Mongol herders rarely handled them at first, letting nature shape their courage. A foe that stayed close to its mother during storms, that stood firm when wolves howled, that ran without tripping. These were the silent tests that decided its future. When the time came to separate the yearlings, the herders used lassos made from rawhide, and songs passed down through generations. Their chants were rhythmic, meant to calm the herd and remind them that the human voice was part of the wind, not a threat against it. The chosen foe were branded with the family's mark, not to claim ownership, but to seal kinship. The Mongols didn't breed for size, color, or showmanship. They bred for the horse that would carry them through freezing blizzards and endless wars, that would gallop from one end of an empire to the other without collapsing. In the end, every Mongol horse was both wild and wise, loyal and free. They weren't made by hands, but by hunger, storms, and the fierce mercy of the steppe itself. To understand Mongol horse care, one must first understand the land itself, a sea of grass that rolled from horizon to horizon, changing color with the seasons, but never its nature. The Mongols didn't own the steppe, they shared breath with it. The land was both cradle and battlefield, and their horses thrived in its extremes. There were no fences, no stables, no artificial boundaries. A horse might wander for days, yet always find its way back by scent, memory, and instinct sharper than any compass. Each family's herd was part of a larger rhythm. During summer, horses grazed on the lush plains near rivers and lakes, drinking freely and growing strong on the fat grasses. When winter came, the herds were driven to higher ground, where the snow was thinner and the wind stripped the grass bare. There, the horses learned to pore through ice for food, to eat frozen grass, and to survive without human help. Mongol horses didn't depend on men. They made men depend on them. Every few days, herders rode out to check their herds, not to feed or shelter them, but to observe. They studied how the animals grouped, how they moved, how the foss followed. The bond between herder and horse was built on patience, not possession. Mongols often said, "The steppe feeds what it loves and kills what it doesn't." That was not cruelty. It was understanding. When storms swept across the plains, the horses gathered in tight circles, heads turned inward, shielding the foss with their bodies. The humans watched and learned. Nature taught them how to survive, and they imitated her lessons. Mongol tents called jurs were round for that reason, the shape of endurance. Horses were never overworked or broken. After long campaigns or journeys, they were released to heal naturally. A warrior might own 100 mounts, rotating them between rest and battle, ensuring no single horse was ever driven to exhaustion. This was the secret behind Mongol mobility, the world's first system of animal logistics. While other empires bred horses for prestige, the Mongols bred them for partnership. The land raised them, the wind hardened them, and the riders honored them. Together, they became unstoppable. A Mongol's relationship with his horse was intimate, practical, and sacred all at once. Every drop of sustenance the steppe offered came through these creatures, milk, sweat, and sometimes blood. When food was scarce, a warrior might open a vein in his horse's neck, drink a few mouthfuls of warm blood, and seal the wound with felt or ashes. The horse would live, the man would survive. It was not cruelty but kinship, the sharing of life in the bleak arithmetic of survival. Mars's milk, known as arag or fermented kumis, was the drink of the steppe. It nourished nomads when grain was impossible to grow and water was locked beneath winter ice. To milk a mare was an art. The herder sang softly, stroking the neck, reminding her that she and her foe were safe. The milk was warm, sharp, and wild, just like the people who drank it. In summer, families fermented barrels of it, the air thick with its tang. Guests were greeted with a bowl of arag, and refusing it was like refusing the Mongol soul. Sweat was another offering. After long rides, a warrior wiped the foam from his horse's neck and rubbed it into his own skin, believing it gave him the beast's endurance and courage. It was half superstition, half science. Mongol warriors smelled of their mounts, a scent that mingled with wind and leather, masking them from enemies who relied on scent to track them. When winter tightened its grip and snow devoured the grass, Mongols slaughtered only the old or wounded. Every part of the horse was used: meat for food, hide for boots and tents, bones for tools, sinew for bowrings. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. To care for a horse was to care for oneself. Mongol herders groomed them not for beauty, but to check for frostbite, injury, or infection. A horse's health was a mirror of its rider's spirit. If the animal grew sick, the family took it as a warning. Someone among them had grown careless or prideful. The Mongols didn't separate life from the herd. They were one body, breathing across the steppe, feeding one another through milk, sweat, and blood. In Mongol life, the herd was an extension of the family, not a possession. The horses grazed freely, and yet every man, woman, and child knew which animals were theirs. A family's fortune could be measured not in coins, but in hoof-beat ats, the rhythm of life echoing across the plains. Each horse had a name often inspired by its color or temperament. Wind-skyled, iron hoof, cloudstepper. These weren't poetic indulgences, but emotional bonds spoken with the same affection reserved for kin. Women played a vital role in managing the herds. While men rode off to war or trade, it was often the women who milked, tamed, and tended to the animals. A skilled Mongol woman could ride as fiercely as any warrior, and read the behavior of the herd like a poem written in motion. She could tell which mare was ready to foe, which stallion was restless, and which young horse was destined to be a champion. Their eyes were their tools, their intuition sharper than any instrument. Children were introduced to the herd as soon as they could stand. Their toys were miniature saddles and bows, and their first lessons were about how to approach a horse gently, how to listen to its breathing, and how to fall without fear. Falling, in fact, was a rite of passage. A child who fell and rose without tears earned laughter and praise. The Mongols believed bravery began not in battle, but in the bond between rider and horse. During migrations, the herd moved with the family, forming part of the caravan that rolled endlessly across the grasslands. Horses carried not just warriors, but household goods, yurts, and even children bundled in furs. The herds grazed at night, while the families slept under the stars, guarded by the dogs and the hum of wind through horsehair ropes. There was no sharp divide between human and animal. Both were children of the same steppe. The Mongols believed that the horse's spirit lingered even after death, watching over its former rider. When a great warrior died, his favorite horse was often released rather than slain, set free to wander, to find its master again in dreams or in the wind that swept across eternity. Training a Mongol horse was not an act of domination. It was a conversation. The Mongols didn't break their horses as many settled civilizations did. They taught them through rhythm, repetition, and respect. A Mongol herder would spend days simply being near a young horse, speaking softly, mimicking its movements, letting trust grow like grass after spring rain. Only when the bond was visible in the animal's calm eyes would training begin. The first step was desensitization. Foss were introduced to sounds of wind, drums, and the crackle of fire early, so that nothing on the battlefield would frighten them. Children, light and agile, were often the first to mount them bareback, with only a rope around the neck.